Hi, I am Tata Martinez. I am the Senior Disaster Risk Management Specialist of the World Bank here in Manila. Today, we will be discussing the menu of shelter options. For today's session, the objectives are as follows. 1. List the objectives of the Post-Disaster Shelter Recovery Policy Framework. 2. Describe the recovery vision in terms of post-disaster shelter options. And 3. Identify appropriate post-disaster shelter recovery options to be included in the list of PPAs. First, we will be discussing the Post-Disaster Shelter Recovery Policy Framework. The PDSF defines an integrated set of post-disaster shelter recovery interventions that establish a consistent approach among key shelter agencies and other agencies and actors, support the country's overall affordable and resilient shelter development and financing policies and strategies, contribute to larger social and economic development goals, including reduction of future disaster risk, restoration of livelihoods, and poverty reduction. The aim is to eliminate situations where households are still languishing 2 or 3 years after the disaster event without a clear path to recovery. Able-bodied people are waiting for assistance when, with the right support, they are capable of managing their own recovery. Recovered households are no safer than before, and poverty increases in affected regions, and communities are resilient after a disaster than before. Diverse agencies and actors are working on their own without guidance or commitment to concrete results. Available resources are spent, but the outcomes are hard to see. And there is limited reporting of actual expenditures and results, and no accountability to affected households and taxpayers. So now, let us discuss the menu of shelter options. The focus of the PDSF is permanent shelter recovery. However, emergency and transitional shelter choices can affect permanent shelter recovery. Therefore, shelter solutions should be considered as a whole. Here we have emergency shelter, which takes up to 1 to 4 weeks, and then the transitional or temporary shelter, which takes up to 12 to 18 months, and then the permanent shelter, which takes up to 1 to 3 years. Modalities are grouped based on the different disaster phases. Appropriate modalities would differ depending on disaster events and local circumstances. Now, let us talk about emergency shelter. Emergency shelter applies to all households. This may include evacuation centers, host families, or sheltering in place. For emergency shelter, government's role is to identify locations and develop procedures for operating the evacuation centers and for identifying affected families. Government also needs to ensure that the families can quickly transition back home or to the next stage of the sheltering process. And then we have temporary shelter. Temporary shelter may include host families, self-settlement, or when families affected by disaster look for or build their own homes, temporary housing like bunk houses, collective centers such as hotels and unused private buildings, and camps for internally displaced people. This phase covers the gap between sheltering and return of affected households to their permanent dwellings. Temporary shelters are provided because often the provision of permanent shelters take a long while, especially if it involves land acquisition or resettlement from high-risk areas. Then we have permanent shelter. Permanent shelter options are medium-term interventions that lead to safe and permanent solutions. These interventions can be categorized into 2: single-family housing and multi-family dwellings. Under single-family housing, we have the following shelter modalities: unsupported repair or reconstruction, owner-managed repair or reconstruction with technical support, community-managed repair or reconstruction with technical support, agency-managed or contractor-built construction, resettlement or relocation, and basic service provision with disaster risk reduction. Remember, all single-family housing modalities will require access to land. This may be at the original housing location, in situ, or a new site. For multifamily housing, we have the following modalities: assistance to landlords and assistance to tenants and other households. The reason why we have these options on rental support to landlords and tenants is because based on the survey of the Philippine Statistics Authority, 35% of the population in many provinces in the Philippines are actually renters. In summary, please remember the following points. First, the PDSF defines an integrated set of post-disaster shelter recovery interventions to achieve the recovery vision. Second, the focus of the PDSF is permanent shelter recovery. However, emergency and transitional shelter choices can affect permanent shelter recovery. Therefore, shelter solutions should be considered as a whole. And lastly, there are 3 phases of shelter recovery options: emergency, temporary or transitional, and permanent. The modalities would differ depending on disaster event and local circumstances. Thank you for your attention.